Hi, Misha here, and this is part 2 looking at our modern day strategic bombers used by the United States Air Force. In part 1, of course, we looked at the B-52 Stratofortress, the Buff. That was a long video, but I want to at least give a good feel for this plane. In this one, we're going to look at the B-1B Lancer, or as it's more commonly known, the Bone. This bomber is quite a bit different from the B-52. It is supersonic. It has variable geometry wings, 4 engines. It's quite long but quite narrow, as you see. Definitely a much more modern looking design, but it had an extremely protracted developmental process and a relatively short service life if current estimates are to be believed. And just to be clear, this is another 1/200 scale model from Herpa, just like the 52. Well, this dates all the way back to 1955, so about the time the B-52 is coming online. The Air Force puts out an idea that it wants a new supersonic high altitude bomber. And this results in 1957 in the North American XB-70 Valkyrie being selected. And the Valkyrie was to be very fast. It could go up to Mach 3 when it was at an altitude of 50 to 70,000 feet. So very high, very fast. Of course, this came at a cost, mostly to do with payload and somewhat to do with range as well, because you're going to be consuming a lot of fuel. But for the nuclear deterrent of the day, this made sense. It would be able to fly higher and faster than Soviet fighters, interceptors, and just basically missiles could not catch up with it. Well, as I've said many times in videos, by the late 50s, early 60s, this Soviet tech would catch up. So the U.S. Air Force switched to low-level, so-called penetration bombing, and the Valkyrie design would not perform well at low level. It would actually be subsonic. It would be faster than the B-52, but not by much. It would have a limited payload and limited range, so it was really not needed. Therefore, in '61, the new Kennedy administration shit-canned it. Not a bad call, honestly. From that point through 1964, there were a ton of design studies, thought experiments, planning, replanning. You'll see Boeing, North American, General Dynamics get involved, doing designs back and forth. There's just a lot of back and forth. Well, finally in 1964, the Air Force comes up with new proposals. It needs a plane that can basically operate at high altitudes and low altitudes, go at least Mach 2, have the bomb carrying capability and the range of the B-52, but the speed of the B-58 Hustler, kind of combining that. Well, the problem is, in this time, obviously President Kennedy is no longer with us in '64, but Secretary of Defense McNamara is still there, and he was never a big fan of bombers. He preferred ICBMs. So, throughout his tenure until 1968, he vetoed as much as he could any development on a new bomber, basically only allowing the Air Force to just do tests and experimental planes, but no full production ideas. Instead, like I said, he would go for ICBMs. He would also allow and say, hey, just update your B-52s. So not much happened. He did allow for the F-111, later known as the Aardvark. And this was a variable sweep wing geometry, low-level interdictor. While it had nothing like the payload of the B-52, it was fast and it could deliver a nuclear weapon or a reasonable amount of conventional weapons. So essentially, he allowed the Air Force to place quite a large order for the F-111 instead, kind of as a compromise, a light bomber, if you will. And we have a video on that, so if you're interested, it's a cool plane. Kind of looks like a baby version of this. Well, then Nixon comes in, his administration, and much of this is reversed. He's more a fan of bombers. So early on, 69 and 70, he cuts the F-111 purchases back and instead allows the Air Force to go forward with developing a new bomber. Again, we have Boeing, General Dynamics, and North American joining now with Rockwell. And in 1970, competition is held, 71. In June of that year, the North American Rockwell design is selected for the B-1 project, becoming the XB-1A. Initially, 5 prototypes are ordered. Then it's cut down to 3. The first one flying in December of 1974. It's also worth pointing out that in 76, a 4th prototype was allowed. So a total of 4 B-1As were constructed in the 70s. And the B-1A, which this is not here, but is very close, it was a Mach 2.25 plane at altitude, but at low altitude it can only do about 0.85, so faster than the B-52, but not by much, and still clearly subsonic. But it did have the payload of the B-52, and it had good range. Unfortunately, the project was also very expensive, and kind of like the B-52 before it, by the time it actually was getting into production, it was starting to look already outdated, because again, Soviet tech and everything needs change. The B-1A was projected to be in service by 1979, but politics would get in the way more than once. Swept the wings back there for you, give you a different view. The B-1A, was a pretty big bone of contention, pun intended, in the 1976 election. The Democrats, Carter, was critical of it, calling it outdated, a waste of money, kind of an albatross, and vowing to cut it. One thing that hurt the B-1A's high altitude, high speed thing was the news of the new Russian MiG-31 interceptor, which was an update of their MiG-25. So its role was really looking questionable. It looked like maybe just didn't really seem like it was worth the money, and they were continuing to run into technical problems with it. It was costing so much money, blah, blah, blah. Carter won the election very quickly in 77. He ordered a review of this project, and then in June of 77, he cut funding. Instead, he authorized the update of the B-52 again, and more ICBMs. And then very soon in private, he authorized work on a stealth bomber which would ultimately result in the B-2, but of course at the time the public did not know this. So B-1A production ended with 4 prototypes. Now the presidency, they did allow test flights and evaluations and whatnot to continue occurring with these. So this would happen through the early 80s. And of course, during the 1980 election, the Reagan administration used the cancellation of the B-1 to call Carter soft on communism. So when Reagan got in, again, studies were ordered. The B-2, the stealth, was examined. The Reagan administration thought the stealth fighter would not be ready for quite a while. They liked it, but it wouldn't be ready. They also thought the B-52, while still viable in the early 80s, would only remain so for another few years, maybe 1984, 1985. They pointed out that it was vulnerable to the MiG-31. So, in late 1981, Rockwell, which North American was a division of now, was authorized to pick back up with the B-1 project, and this is where the B-1B comes from. The government will order 100 updated planes. There were many changes, including more of a multi-role. The original B-1 was pretty much just a nuclear bomber. The B-1B was going to be a multi-role, so conventional or nuclear, although it still had a heavy emphasis on nuclear. They would actually improve its maximum takeoff weight, meaning it could carry more fuel and or ordnance. And they would improve the engines. They would strengthen the airframe. They would remove weight where necessary and beef it up where also needed. And they would, of course, update the computer system. It would get a new IBM computer, same as used on the newer B-52 updates and even the space shuttle. No surprise, since Rockwell and IBM were all involved there. And, of course, on and on, many other changes. And of course, since they've been flying the B-1A for so long, there wasn't a huge teething thing. They would get the design ready in 83, put them into production. There'd be some test flights that year. Then the initial rollout of the B-1B would happen in September of 84, and the production, or at least a pre-production B-1B, would take its first test flight in October. And that's actually reports at this time are where the name Bone comes from. Instead of writing B space numeral 1, it's alleged that at least one news article wrote B1 as in B1 spelled out. So B-O-N-E, Bone. Funny story. Hope it's true. You can't trust what you read on the internet, but I do know it's been called the Bone since the 80s, so there it is. The 100 aircraft would all be delivered by 1988 to the government and start flight testing and go into service. But what do we have here? It's a very long plane, not as long as the 52, but we're at 146 feet. The variable geometry wings, very much like on the Aardvark, can sweep out almost 140 feet and under 80 feet. The idea is to have them fully out when taking off from less than ideal airfields and landing, and then to sweep them in for cruise, and then sweep them fully back for quick dashes. You know, bombing, running in and out. Gives it that flexibility. We have a crew of 4, so a smaller crew than previous bombers. Pilot, commander, offensive and defensive system officers. We have a pretty impressive theoretical maximum payload. It can carry up to 50,000 pounds on half a dozen external hardpoints, or 70,000 pounds in 3 internal bomb bays. Although in practice it would be very hard to load this thing up that much. You wouldn't get much range. We have a pretty high altitude. It can get up to 60,000 feet, so about 10,000 more than the B-52's max. The B-1B was slower than the B-1A. It could only do about Mach 1.2 to 1.25, but there were some advantages to this. For one, that was at high altitude. Its low altitude speed, while still subsonic, was improved. It was at least 0.9, maybe a little more. So a bump faster at lower altitudes. More importantly, because of the new engines, it had a lower cross-section on radar. It was more stealthy, not a stealth plane, but more stealthy than the previous design. So that helps. And again, it was designed to carry both conventional and nuclear ordnance, with nuclear being the primary back in the 80s. And this was a stopgap measure until the B-2 was finally ready. As for the Bones service, the Strategic Air Command, SAC, received its first one in 1985, and by 1986, it was reporting operational readiness, and these were put on nuclear alert, kind of taking over from a lot of the older B-52s. And as I said, in 1988, the contract was complete. These were not used in the 1991 Gulf War. Ostensibly, 40 out of the 100 did have the ability to drop conventional weapons at the time, but it was a relatively limited capability. They weren't really set up for it, and they had been having some engine trouble, and so these were kept out. The B-52 was sent in instead. The B-1 was kept at home as part of nuclear deterrent. But then after the Soviet Union collapsed, things warmed up. The START Treaty and all that. And 1992, the Bush administration ordered that the remaining B-1Bs be updated to carry conventional weapons. And then during the Clinton administration, the B-1B's nuclear capability altogether was removed around 1995, thereabouts, as part of the START Treaty. So by the late 90s, these are pretty much all fitted out as conventional bombers, and they were upgraded as needed to deliver smart weapons. The first time these would be used in live actual combat was against Iraq and sanction violations in December of 1998 during Operation Desert Fox. These would deliver guided JDAM bombs. Then they would be used the next year in Kosovo during the UN peacekeeping operation. And then they would be deployed in Afghanistan in 2001 and back to Iraq in 2003. Here, they would often be used either to take out targets with precision-guided munitions, or they would actually loiter in the sky and be available for close air support, where ground troops could call in a strike if needed from a B-1B. It had good loiter time. It was faster, more survivable against newer weaponry than the B-52. In fact, 8 B-1Bs did some pretty good damage during the opening days of the Second Gulf War, and one was kept flying 24/7 for close air support early on as well. Now, at this time, the Air Force had 93 active B-1Bs, and they decided to mothball 33 of them, bringing the fleet down to 60. This is so they could afford, within their budget, to update and modernize these. For example, they wanted to install a lightning pod, as well as modern communications equipment, and of course just general maintenance and refurbishment. So we dropped the number down in service to 60, but then the next year they find it in the budget to reactivate 7, bring the number back up to 67, and these would continue to see use in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're available for close air support. The B-1B was used in Operation Odyssey Dawn in Libya, 2011, and it's been deployed in Syria since 2014, doing this and that. I think one of the funnier things it's done recently, a couple of these were sent to fly really close by North Korea in 2017, in that summer, honestly just to piss off the North Korean government. It was part of technically a training exercise with South Korea, but yeah. So these are still flying today. As of last year, there are 62 active B-1Bs. They entered into a pretty extensive refurbishment upgrade program in 2014, which is completing this year, where all the fleet will be again modernized to keep it up to date, to work with the newest weaponry. And these are planned to start to be retired in 2025, assuming that the B-21 comes about. And the expected end of service for the B-1B is sometime between 2034 and 2038. Notice that is sooner than the B-52, which is really funny and hilarious. But there you have it. It's one of those planes that for a while probably was just going to be a dead-end project, but has proven to be quite effective and useful. It definitely filled that stopgap measure between the 52 and the B-2. It is a much more modern plane. Its ordnance load is quite impressive, and it can operate from shorter or lesser conditioned airfields than the B-52. And it requires a smaller crew. So it does have a lot going for it. Of course, it came at a cost, but there it is. That's government spending for you. Cold War spending. Again, much like with the model before, this one is pretty much all metal. As you saw, the wings do move. I can't remember if they're metal or plastic. They might be metal. I think they are. So it's our tail that is plastic, our body and wings are metal, thin metal on the wings because it's a small one. It's a pretty neat plane. It really is. I like the looks of this plane. Very long and dagger-like. Well, if you would join me for part 3, we will check out the B-2 Spirit and wrap this up, guys. But I figured I did a look at the British bombers. It was only honest we'd check out the Americans, even if these are a little bit of tiny models. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. I'll catch you very soon next time.